The Vex'thali omnipotent testing syndicate had been in the business of crushing dreams and cataloguing failures for approximately 5,000 galactic standard years, which was roughly equivalent to the time it took most civilizations to discover fire, invent bureaucracy, and then wonder why they bothered with either. Their headquarters floated serenely in the Andromeda Nexus, a crystalline monument to intellectual superiority that looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a mathematics textbook and then given the whole thing a superiority complex. The Syndicate's evaluation protocol had become something of a legend across 17 different galactic arms, though not the kind of legend that involved heroic deeds or inspiring victories. More like the kind of legend that parents used to frighten their offspring into studying harder and questioning their life choices less frequently. The test itself was officially called the Universal Species Competency Assessment, but most beings referred to it by names that couldn't be translated into polite company without causing diplomatic incidents. What made the Vex'thali particularly insufferable was their meticulous record-keeping. They maintained detailed archives of every species that had attempted their evaluation, complete with psychological profiles, failure analyses, and what they euphemistically called post-test adjustment periods. The Mollusk Confederation of Rigel had required 3 centuries of intensive therapy after their attempt. The crystalline architects of Vega Prime had dissolved themselves into component molecules rather than face the implications of their performance. Most memorably, the entire warrior caste of the Draconian Empire had collectively decided that violence was statistically meaningless and taken up competitive flower arranging. The test facility itself was a masterwork of intimidation architecture. Imagine a structure designed by beings who had read every psychology textbook ever written, concluded that subtlety was for amateurs, and decided to create a building that would make visitors question their fundamental assumptions about reality before they even filled out the preliminary paperwork. The walls were constructed from a material that somehow managed to be simultaneously black and reflective, creating the unsettling impression that the building was watching you watch it watch you. Inside, the corridors twisted through dimensions that probably violated several laws of physics and definitely violated good taste. The lighting came from sources that couldn't be identified but somehow managed to make everyone look like they were dying of something particularly unpleasant. The air recycling system produced a subtle humming sound that, after extensive analysis, had been determined to be the exact frequency that made most sentient beings contemplate the futility of existence. Into this temple of psychological warfare walked Dmitri Volkov, representative of the species that had somehow managed to survive on a planet that treated natural selection like a contact sport. He was approximately 2 meters tall, built like someone who lifted heavy objects for recreational purposes, and possessed the kind of cheerful demeanor that suggested he either didn't understand the gravity of his situation or understood it perfectly and found it amusing. The reception committee consisted of 3 Vex'thali administrators, whose names were unpronounceable combinations of mathematical concepts and philosophical despair. The lead administrator, whose identity roughly translated to harbinger of enlightenment through systematic humiliation, regarded the human with the kind of clinical interest typically reserved for particularly fascinating bacterial cultures. "Welcome, representative of the human species," the administrator intoned through a translation matrix that made everything sound like a funeral dirge performed by depressed robots. "You stand before the most comprehensive evaluation of species worthiness ever devised by rational minds, operating at peak intellectual capacity." Dmitri looked around the reception area with the casual interest of someone touring a moderately impressive shopping mall. Interesting aesthetic choices, very existential dread meets corporate efficiency. "Did you guys hire the same designers who do dentist offices?" The administrator's 4 eyes performed a synchronized blink that might have been confusion or possibly a minor system malfunction. In 5,000 years of testing, no species had ever commented on their interior design philosophy, primarily because most were too busy having nervous breakdowns or spontaneous religious conversions. The Universal Species Competency Assessment consists of 3 primary evaluation phases, the administrator continued, determined to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. Each phase has been scientifically calibrated to test the absolute limits of species' capability across multiple dimensional matrices of competence and understanding. Sounds thorough, Dmitri replied, producing what appeared to be a metallic container from his clothing and taking a sip of its contents. The liquid inside was dark enough to absorb light and smelled like burnt ambition. Coffee, he explained, noticing the administrator's horrified fascination. It's basically liquid motivation with a caffeine delivery system. Want some? Fair warning though, it's been known to dissolve metal if you leave it sitting too long. The first phase materialized around them, with the kind of dramatic environmental shift that the Vex'thali had perfected after millennia of practice. The reception area dissolved into a hellscape that borrowed liberally from every known species' worst nightmares about physical existence. The testing chamber became a deep ocean environment, with crushing pressures that could compress most beings into decorative paperweights, filled with water that was somehow simultaneously boiling and freezing while maintaining a chemical composition that could dissolve molecular bonds. The proud aquatic dominion of Kepler 442 had lasted exactly 47 seconds in this environment before their delegation had begun speaking in tongues and declaring their intent to become land-dwelling philosophers. The technologically advanced cybernetic collective had experienced cascading system failures that required complete personality reconstruction. Dmitri looked around at the impossible underwater hellscape, took another sip of his coffee, and said, this is actually pretty nice. Reminds me of scuba diving in the Mariana Trench, except the water's cleaner, and there aren't any giant squids trying to discuss philosophy while they eat you." The administrator's tentacles began performing what his species recognized as early-stage panic choreography. The pressure differential should be crushing your skeletal structure. The water temperature fluctuations should be causing cellular breakdown. The chemical composition should be dissolving your molecular integrity. "Yeah, it's definitely got some kick to it," Dmitri agreed, apparently breathing the impossible water-air mixture without any noticeable difficulty. "Though to be honest, this feels like a pretty standard Tuesday back home. You should see what our oceans are like during hurricane season. Now that's what I call challenging." The crushing pressure that had reduced several species to their component atoms was being processed by the human's physiology like a mild workout session. He moved through the environment with the casual efficiency of someone who had spent his formative years in places where the laws of physics were more like friendly suggestions. As the first phase continued, Dmitri provided running commentary that suggested he was genuinely enjoying the experience. "Nice touch with the bioluminescent death coral. Very atmospheric. Though the pH balance could use some work. It's only about as acidic as our soft drinks." The administrator frantically consulted his instruments, convinced that reality itself was malfunctioning. The readings were precise. The environment was exactly as lethal as designed. The human should have been a puddle of liquefied organic compounds by now, not offering constructive criticism on their environmental design choices. With growing desperation, the administrator initiated the second phase of evaluation. The underwater nightmare dissolved, replaced by what the Vex'thali proudly called their mental dissolution protocol, a psychological landscape designed to systematically deconstruct rational thought through carefully calibrated applications of existential horror, logical paradoxes, and the kind of philosophical despair that made beings question whether thinking was worth the effort. The scenario was a masterpiece of mental warfare that had taken the Vex'thali's finest minds approximately 800 years to perfect. Subjects found themselves in a realm where cause and effect were optional, where their memories were simultaneously true and false, and where every thought they had ever considered important was revealed to be statistically meaningless in the context of an infinite, indifferent universe. The scenario had driven the hyper-intellectual Cerebral Confederation to conclude that consciousness itself was a design flaw, and voluntarily lobotomized themselves. The warrior philosophers of the Stoic hegemony had experienced such complete existential breakdown that they had disbanded their entire civilization and taken up competitive meditation. Dmitri found himself floating in a void that somehow managed to be darker than the absence of light, while simultaneously being too bright to look at directly. Voices that might have been his own thoughts or possibly the universe having an identity crisis whispered things like, "Nothing you do matters," and "Existence is a statistical error." He listened to this for approximately 30 seconds, then said, "You know, this is actually pretty relaxing. It's like those white noise machines, except instead of ocean sounds, it's the universe having an existential crisis. Very soothing." The administrator's worldview began developing structural damage. "You are experiencing complete ontological dissolution. The very foundations of rational thought are being systematically deconstructed. You should be questioning the nature of existence itself." "Oh, I did that last Thursday," Dmitri replied cheerfully. "Turns out existence is pretty weird, but coffee helps. Plus, once you accept that nothing makes sense, everything becomes surprisingly manageable. You guys seem to have missed that part of the philosophical journey." The mental dissolution protocol continued its assault on rational thought, but Dmitri appeared to be treating the entire experience like an entertaining philosophical discussion, with particularly dramatic special effects. He occasionally nodded thoughtfully at particularly creative examples of existential horror, and once complimented the scenario designers on their innovative approach to cosmic insignificance visualization. The third and final phase materialized with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested the administrator was now operating purely on institutional pride and rapidly diminishing professional confidence. This was the impossible combat matrix, a virtual battlefield where subjects faced progressively more challenging opponents specifically designed to exploit their species' tactical weaknesses while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of violent solutions to cosmic problems. The Matrix had reduced the militaristic Conquest Federation to pacifists, who refused to participate in aggressive activities more challenging than competitive poetry reading. The technologically superior War Machine Collective had concluded that conflict was mathematically pointless and had reprogrammed themselves to manufacture decorative garden sculptures. Dmitri found himself in what appeared to be a battlefield that stretched across multiple dimensions, facing opponents that seemed to have been designed by beings who had read every military strategy manual ever written and then decided to ignore all of them in favor of creating something that was more conceptual art than actual combat scenarios. His first opponent was a geometric entity that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously while shooting energy weapons that fired compressed mathematics. His second opponent appeared to be a sentient black hole that had learned martial arts and developed strong opinions about military ethics. By his 15th opponent, he was facing what could only be described as the physical manifestation of the concept of inevitable defeat, which looked like a giant robot made of crystallized despair and shot lasers that made targets question their life choices. "Okay, now this is actually pretty fun," Dmitri said, engaging the impossible combat scenario with the casual competence of someone who had spent his youth playing games where the primary objective was to die creatively and frequently. "Though I have to say, your enemy AI needs some work. Very predictable attack patterns. Also, why does everything keep trying to convince me that violence is meaningless? I already know that, doesn't mean it's not sometimes necessary." He proceeded to systematically dismantle the impossible combat matrix with a combination of tactical thinking and what could charitably be described as weaponized pragmatism. The Vex'thali had designed their opponents to be unbeatable through superior firepower, impossible abilities, and psychological warfare that would convince subjects that fighting was ultimately pointless. They had not accounted for a species that considered impossible odds to be standard operating procedure, and pointless fighting to be a recreational activity with valuable exercise benefits. "They've 43 already?" Dmitri asked, casually defeating what appeared to be a mechanical deity that shot philosophical arguments instead of bullets. "This is like that old arcade game from my childhood, except with better graphics and more existential commentary. Do you guys have a high scoreboard? Because I think I might be setting some records here." The administrator watched in growing horror as his carefully calibrated impossible scenario was being treated like an entertaining video game by someone who appeared to be genuinely enjoying the experience. The human was winning consistently, methodically, and apparently having a wonderful time doing it. "This is mathematically impossible," the administrator finally shrieked, abandoning all pretense of scientific objectivity. The combat matrix has a statistical certainty of failure. No species has ever progressed beyond wave 20. What's the theoretical maximum? Dmitri asked, dispatching a robot dragon that quoted ancient philosophy while breathing fire that burned at the temperature of existential dread. There isn't one. The system generates opponents indefinitely until subjects achieve psychological breakdown. Cool. So it's basically an endurance challenge. I can work with that. The administrator's understanding of reality was crumbling faster than a poorly constructed philosophical argument. Everything the Vex'thali had believed about intelligence, about species development, about the fundamental nature of evaluation itself, was being systematically demolished by a creature that drank industrial solvent for pleasure and treated cosmic-scale challenges as mild entertainment. "You don't understand," the administrator wailed, his professional composure collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. "This assessment is designed to reveal the ultimate truth about species capability, to demonstrate the boundaries of rational thought, to show beings their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy." Dmitri paused in his methodical destruction of the impossible combat matrix to give the administrator a look of genuine curiosity. "Why would you want to do that? That sounds incredibly limiting. Who convinced you that beings need to know their place in some cosmic hierarchy? That's like saying people should only dream small dreams because big ones might be disappointing." And that was the precise moment when the Vex'thali Omnipotent Testing Syndicate's Universal Species Competency Assessment experienced what the official records would later describe as catastrophic paradigm failure. The administrator stared at this human, this impossible, coffee-drinking, reality-ignoring representative of a species that had somehow completely missed the memo about accepting limitations, and realized that perhaps they had been asking fundamentally wrong questions for 5,000 years. The combat scenario flickered and died as the administrator's certainty collapsed like a philosophical argument based on faulty premises. The testing chamber returned to its original configuration, though somehow the intimidating architecture now seemed less impressive and more like an expensive monument to overthinking. "So," Dmitri said, checking what appeared to be a primitive chronometer while finishing the last of his coffee, "is there like a final boss level? Or was that it? Because this has been genuinely entertaining, but I promised my wife I'd pick up groceries on the way home, and you know how it is with domestic responsibilities." The administrator sat in stunned silence for what felt like several geological epochs, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, in a voice that suggested his entire species was going to require extensive psychological counseling, he asked, "How? How did you survive evaluations that have broken the greatest civilizations in the galaxy? How did you find enjoyment in experiences designed to demonstrate the futility of existence?" Dmitri shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who had just been asked to explain why breathing was useful. "I guess we're just used to it. Earth's pretty challenging. Between the weather trying to kill us, the wildlife trying to eat us, the geology trying to crush us, and our own tendency to make everything more complicated than necessary, we learned early that life's tough, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun. Plus, your test felt a lot like our entertainment industry, except with lower production values and more philosophical monologuing." The administrator processed this information with the kind of slow, horrified realization that typically preceded species-wide identity crises. "Your entertainment is comparable to our ultimate evaluation of species worthiness?" "Well, sort of, though our stuff usually has better character development and more coherent plot structures. You might want to consider hiring some human consultants if you're planning to keep doing this evaluation thing. We could really help you improve the user experience, maybe add some difficulty settings, better reward systems." And so it was that the Vex'thali Omnipotent Testing Syndicate, after 5,000 years of administering their Universal Species Competency Assessment, discovered that they had been approaching the entire concept of evaluation from the wrong philosophical direction. They had created a test designed to reveal limitations and demonstrate boundaries, only to encounter a species that treated limitations as starting points and boundaries as suggestions. The ultimate irony which would be discussed in xenopsychology courses for millennia to come, was that the humans hadn't actually passed the test in any conventional sense. They had simply failed to understand that it was supposed to be impossible, approaching each phase with the bewildering optimism of a species that had somehow survived on a planet that seemed dedicated to creative homicide. As Dmitri headed back to handle his domestic responsibilities, the administrator was left to contemplate the possibility that intelligence might not be about understanding limitations, but about the peculiar ability to transcend them while maintaining perspective about the whole absurd situation. The Vex'thali would eventually redesign their evaluation system, though it would never again carry quite the same air of ultimate authority. After all, it's difficult to maintain an aura of cosmic significance when you've been out-philosophized by someone whose primary concern is whether the local grocery store still has those cookies his wife likes. The universe, as it turned out, had been playing an elaborate practical joke for billions of years. It just took meeting the humans to get the punchline.